I think one of the reasons I found The Mandalorian such an interesting show, other than its space cowboy vibes, was the fact that the show focused on what felt like normal people. Strong people, sure, but for once, this entry into the Star Wars canon, the focus was not on the supernaturally strong Jedi, but on just a guy who can fight good. It also showed us a bit more of the Mandalorian culture, particularly the community Din Djarin is from, simply known as the Tribe. Today, I want to talk a little bit about how the Mandalorian society has been pictured throughout the Star Wars franchise and how it helps to demonstrate certain aspects of the connections between nationalism and religion. We should first start with the Mandalorians. Initially, Mandalorians were only given small references here and there, but over time, the community and culture grew in prominence in the series. The background of the society was painted as far bigger than originally conceived, demonstrating a growth of what was called Mandalorian space. Like many of the cultures in Star Wars, Mandalorians were a colonialist force which spread to multiple areas of the galaxy and expanded the growth of their culture. Historically, Mandalorians were prized warriors. They were known as a strong military force, which contributed to the growth of their reach throughout colonies. As time continued, though, the needs shifted from expansion to retention. In the Clone Wars, we see Mandalorians as also being political and involved in delegation. This shift in culture had resistance. Because also in the Clone Wars, we are introduced to the Death Watch, a nationalistic resistance group who wanted to return to the greater ways of Mandalore, particularly focused on the typical folk practices of Mandalorians. This included a warrior-like way of life. This infighting, as well as the war happening with the Empire, led to a complete dismantlement of the Mandalorian Empire, including a complete wiping of the surface of the planet. This complete dismantlement of the Empire led to a Mandalorian diaspora. Mandalorians had no home to return to, and so either drifted from planet to planet or were forced to find a home somewhere else. So now that we've painted a very brief picture of the history and development of Mandalorians, leading to the Mandalorian diaspora, let's talk a bit about theories of nationalism. Like most things, there are many different theorists to focus on, but we're going to be primarily focusing on Anthony D. Smith. Anthony D. Smith was a British historical sociologist who is one of the founders of the studies of nationalism, so seems like a solid place to start. Smith defines nationalism as, quote, an ideological movement for attaining and maintaining autonomy, unity, and identity on behalf of a population deemed by some of its members to constitute an actual or potential nation. For Smith, nations and nationalism is predicated on ideas of ethnic connection, focusing on a fundamental group of people he calls ethnies. He understands these groups as necessarily having a common word for themselves or their group, common historical memories, and a common historic homeland. Note that the need for a homeland can be historic, not necessarily currently present. This is important to keep in mind for Mandalorians who felt unable to return to their homeland. Similarly, his definition focusing on actual or potential nation also focuses on the fact that the nation doesn't necessarily have to be in existence and in a place to actually visit in order for it to be a nation or recognized as such. But before we return to The Mandalorian, we should talk about one more dimension of Smith's ideas. There are different kinds of ethnies, which result in different types of nations. Smith has two different types of ethnies. Essentially, the civic type of nation prioritizes allegiance to the state above the ethnicity, while ethnic group type nations focus on the ethnic and folk ties. In other words, in the first one, the exact geographical borders of the nation is the more important separation of us and them, while in the second, the culture and the ethnicity becomes the more important borders between the us and them. Religion is important in both of these. I often see Britain, for example, in that first category of a civic nation, but anyone who's been to Wales can see that sometimes ethnicity is also more important than geographical boundaries and allegiance to the state. But even if we only think of it as England instead of Britain, we can still see an importance on religion. I once heard a story from a friend who talked about seeing a filled out census form for the family that his dad had already filled out. It had marked them as Christian. This confused him because as far as he was aware, they weren't Christian, never went to church, didn't really even talk about it at home. So he asked his dad, "Why did you mark us as Christian?" And their dad responded with, "Well, we are English." So even though there are connections to geographical rather than ethnic groups when it comes to civic nations like England, there is often also still connections to tradition and folk culture. Again, like the focus on religion, but also emphasis on ideas of culture and tradition. The UK, for example, has a Life in the UK test that immigrants have to take as a process of becoming citizens. And this has not only important aspects of rules and regulations like tax laws, but it also has important cultural touchstones like famous football players or famous British actors, important aspects of how people celebrate different holidays typically in England. Now, again, this isn't going to capture the idea of every single diasporic group that might end up in England that does contribute to the culture, but rather focuses on a folk idea of the typical kind of traditional practices found in England. So even though there are examples of civic religions being more focused on the state, there is still inherently underneath that the connections to the ethnic group. This all being said, religion is seen as even more important in the ethnic ties type of nation. While in the instance of England, for example, all of the connections to ethnic ties were underneath the aspects of allegiance to the state, in the ethnic group it is far more front and center. This is because the focus is on ethnicity and ethnic performance of culture, meaning that the religion one connects to and relates to is also a marker of your alliance to your nation or ethnic group. According to Smith, the ethnic groupings types of nations are actually more durable than civic ones because they can carry with them connections to one another in their folk traditions and their cultural artifacts and memories, as opposed to civic ones which have more of an emphasis on state and geographical boundaries. So let's get back to our Mandalorians. In the show The Mandalorian, we see a remaining connection to the historic homeland. They still call themselves Mandalorian, even if the planet of Mandalore is thought to be no longer habitable. We see cultural memories also still being passed down, especially in The Mandalorian. All Mandalorians, even when being part of a different diasporic group, all still wear the Vespar armor and also understand their connection to a warrior cultural past. When we first sit down to watch The Mandalorian, we are given a particular understanding of the cultural practice of Mandalorians, as practiced through our main character Din Djarin, who, for actually quite a bit of the first season, is only really known as the Mandalorian, a catch-all understanding of the cultural ties Din Djarin comes to represent. Din Djarin is heavily practiced in fighting and takes pride in his ability to fight due to his Mandalorian nature. We also have as a rule that he must not remove his helmet in front of anyone. We learn when Din Djarin meets Bo-Katan that the tribe Din Djarin finds connection in was an offshoot of the Death Watch. We see similarities in the tribe as in the Death Watch, a focus on the traditions of Mandalorians, a return to the warrior way of life. The emphasis is not on Mandalore as a planetary nation bounded through their geography, but rather as a people bounded to each other through their vernacular tradition. There's an important aspect to the tribe that we see through The Mandalorian. The focus is so much on the traditions and folk practices of their people that this is what holds importance. The important thing is not the blood connection to ethnicity, but the connection to the culture. Culture is therefore not genetic, but can be adopted and carried. We see the tribe welcome Grogu, despite Grogu clearly not being genetically Mandalorian. The importance is that Grogu is a loving member of the community, willing to carry the traditions onward, rather than on his blood relations. From the point of view of an anthropologist of religion, I do have to add quickly here that the depiction of religion from the tribe in Mandalore, and really in all of Star Wars more generally, leaves a whole lot to be desired. It's very surface level and kind of relies on kitschy catch rituals that may seem weird but isn't really lived out in any kind of full or realistic sense, or really is even explained through any kind of realistic means. But that's probably more of a discussion for another time. Given what I have, this is considered a more religious or ritualistic way of living in The Mandalorian, which I will treat as such. In the third season of The Mandalorian, we have a much clearer view of the nationalism within the diasporic Mandalorians. We end up running into 3 different groups of Mandalorians: the tribe, the followers of Bo-Katan, and a group of Mandalorians who have been abandoned on the surface of the planet. Each of these groups have clung to different ideas about their folk traditions and how they embody them. However, each of these have the same fundamentals of what makes an ethnic grouping nation: a name for themselves, Mandalorians; a shared cultural history, the history of the people of Mandalore, and the connection to their homeland of Mandalore. It is this shared ethnic identity that gives them the strength and durability to retake their homeland together. While in their separate groups, in the middle of their Mandalorian diaspora, we see how important it is for them to connect to their shared cultural heritage. Bo-Katan, for example, is unable to lead her group without the Darksaber. Her ability to rule is not really all that different before or after obtaining it, but it's an important cultural symbol, an artifact of Mandalorian ethnic heritage that is important to claim for their historic homeland. For those left on the planet, their shared memory of the destruction of Mandalore keeps them moving forward, knowing through their own cultural knowledge of their people that this is what their whole community will be doing across the galaxy within their own separate groups, and clinging to a story that Bo-Katan will be back for them. The tribe cling to the ways of life of the Mandalorians tied to folk practices, the importance of their armor, their ability to fight, and the inability to remove their helmet, which is, in many ways, connected to the importance of armor. In all of these groups, it's the cultural heritage that becomes the ultimate means of survival, and through it, Mandalorians are able to retain their cultural heritage as Mandalorians and not be assimilated into other nations. One of the interesting elements is the storytelling that is then shared on what it is that constitutes someone to be Mandalorian. We see this when Din Djarin is confronted with Bo-Katan's contingent, who questions whether he really is Mandalorian.
One, I might add, who has not one drop of Mandalorian blood in his veins.
Din Djarin took the creed and chose to walk the way, just as our ancestors did.
Din Djarin's actual genetic ties to Mandalorians are kind of hazy. We know he was living on one of the moons when the Purge of Mandalore happened, but we also know that the tribe is not really all that concerned about genetic ties. Their connection to ethnicity and nation is in folk practices. For others, though, the focus seems to be more on the role of genetics. However, as the show goes on, it's both Din Djarin and Grogu that proves that being Mandalorian is a way of moving through the world rather than in their blood. The Mandalorian shows us a little bit of insight into how communities survive through cultural trauma and diaspora. Through connections to their ethnic group, through acknowledgement of blood relations, cultural practice, and tradition, the Mandalorian people were able to survive as recognizably Mandalorian, even if each faction of Mandalorians had a different way of going about it.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way.